The autumn wind whipped through the empty streets of downtown Seattle as Olivia Bennett pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders. At 23, she had mastered the art of stretching every dollar, but replacing her worn-out jacket wasn't in this month's budget. Not when her nursing school tuition was due in 2 weeks. The digital clock on her phone showed 11:47 p.m. Her feet ached from a double shift at Joe's Diner, followed by 4 hours of restocking shelves at the local pharmacy. But her night wasn't over yet. She still had 3 chapters of anatomy to review before her morning exam. This was her life now, working 3 jobs while chasing her dream of becoming a nurse, running on coffee and determination. Olivia checked her banking app as she walked. The screen glowed mockingly, $50.13. That had to last another week, somehow. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she'd given her lunch to elderly Mrs. Rodriguez at the diner, a regular customer who had forgotten her wallet today. Olivia couldn't bear to see the shame in the old woman's eyes when she couldn't pay for her meal. The streets were eerily quiet tonight, with only the occasional car rushing past. Her apartment building was just ahead, a rundown 6-story walk-up that had seen better days. The rent was barely manageable, but it was close to both her jobs and the hospital where she did her clinical rotations. As she approached the building's entrance, something caught her eye. At first, she thought it was just another shadow, but then she heard it, a faint gasping sound. In the dim light of the street lamp, she saw him. A man in an expensive charcoal suit, clutching his throat, his face rapidly swelling. He was trying to reach for something in his pocket, but his movements were becoming increasingly uncoordinated. Olivia's nursing training kicked in instantly. She rushed to his side, her exhaustion forgotten. "Sir, can you hear me? Are you having trouble breathing?" The man's eyes were wide with panic, his lips starting to turn blue. He managed a weak nod before his knees buckled. She caught him before he hit the ground, gently lowering him to the sidewalk. His wallet fell from his pocket, spilling its contents. A business card skittered across the concrete. Richard Thorne, CEO, Thorne Innovations. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. Everyone knew about Thorne Innovations, the tech company that had revolutionized artificial intelligence last year. Their CEO was worth billions. But right now, he was just a patient who needed help. Olivia's trained eye spotted the telltale signs of anaphylactic shock. "Mr. Thorne, are you allergic to anything?" 1 squeeze for yes, 2 for no. He squeezed her hand once, desperately. Time was running out. She could see his throat continuing to swell, his breathing becoming more labored with each passing second. Without hesitation, she reached into her bag and pulled out her EpiPen, the one she kept for her own shellfish allergy, the one she couldn't afford to replace until next month's paycheck. There wasn't time to second-guess her decision. With practiced precision, she removed the safety cap and firmly pressed the auto-injector against his outer thigh, holding it for a full 10 seconds as she'd been taught. With her other hand, she was already dialing 911. "Emergency services. What's your location?" "Corner of 4th and Pine, outside the Riverside Apartments. I have a male in his 40s in anaphylactic shock. I've administered epinephrine, but he needs immediate medical attention. Please hurry." Her voice was steady, professional, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Olivia kept checking Richard's vitals, talking to him continuously, trying to keep him calm as the epinephrine began to take effect. His breathing gradually became less labored, though his face remained dangerously swollen. "You're doing great, Mr. Thorne. Help is on the way. Try to stay still and focus on taking slow breaths." She held his hand, noting how his expensive watch probably cost more than her entire year's tuition. Yet here he was, his life depending on a broke nursing student and her last EpiPen. The wail of approaching sirens split the night air. As the ambulance rounded the corner, Richard's eyes met Olivia's. He tried to speak, but she gently shushed him. "Save your strength. The paramedics will take good care of you." The next few minutes were a blur of activity as the paramedics took over. Olivia gave them a precise rundown of what had happened and the treatment she'd administered. As they loaded Richard into the ambulance, one of the paramedics turned to her. "You probably saved his life. You coming with us to the hospital?" Olivia glanced at her phone. 12:15 a.m. Her anatomy exam was in less than 7 hours. She should go home, study, try to salvage what was left of her night. But something in Richard's eyes, as they loaded him into the ambulance, tugged at her conscience. "Yes," she said, climbing into the ambulance. "I'll come." As they sped through the empty streets, Olivia realized she'd left her anatomy textbook on the sidewalk in all the chaos. She'd also used her last EpiPen, and her next paycheck wasn't for another 2 weeks. But looking at Richard's now stabilizing condition, she knew she'd made the right choice. What she didn't know was that this chance encounter on a cold autumn night would change both their lives forever, though not in the way either of them could have possibly imagined. The fluorescent lights of Seattle General Hospital cast harsh shadows across the emergency room as doctors swarmed around Richard Thorne. Olivia sat in the waiting area, her scrubs from her diner job still carrying the faint smell of coffee and grilled cheese. She watched through the glass doors as Dr. Rita Patel, the attending physician, barked orders to her team. If she hadn't administered the epinephrine when she did, Dr. Patel's voice carried through the partially open door. "We're talking about a 4-minute window, maybe less." Whatever triggered this reaction, it was severe. Olivia's hands trembled slightly as the reality of the situation sank in. She'd been running on pure adrenaline and training until now, but the weight of what had just happened began to settle on her shoulders. Her phone buzzed, a reminder to study for her exam. She ignored it. Hours ticked by. The emergency room's initial chaos gave way to the quiet efficiency of intensive care. Richard had fallen into a coma, his body's response to the massive trauma of the allergic reaction. Olivia found herself unable to leave, even as the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky outside the hospital windows. A nurse approached her around 6 a.m., coffee in hand. "You're the nursing student who saved him, aren't you?" She offered Olivia the coffee. "I'm Whitney. Been here 20 years. Never seen anything quite like this. That man in there?" She gestured toward Richard's room. "His net worth is more than this entire hospital, but money meant nothing tonight. It was your quick thinking that made the difference." Olivia accepted the coffee gratefully, its warmth seeping into her tired hands. "I just did what anyone would do," she murmured, though they both knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have recognized the symptoms, known how to respond, or been willing to give up their last EpiPen. As the morning shift changed over, Dr. Patel emerged from Richard's room, making straight for Olivia. "We've stabilized him, but he's in a coma." The allergic reaction was triggered by a rare compound in some medication he took, combined with his unknown heart condition. She paused, shaking her head. "You didn't just save his life once by administering the EpiPen. Your decision to ride along in the ambulance saved him again. He had a second reaction en route, much milder, but in his weakened state." The doctor's words faded as Olivia processed this information. She hadn't even noticed the second reaction. The paramedics had handled it so smoothly. But if she hadn't been there to provide his medical history from the first reaction, over the next few days, Olivia found herself returning to the hospital between her shifts. She'd missed her anatomy exam. Her professor had been understanding but firm. She'd have to take a reduced grade on the makeup test. But something kept drawing her back to room 742. Richard lay there, surrounded by machines monitoring every aspect of his condition. His executive assistant, Victoria Lane, had arrived from New York, bringing with her a flurry of lawyers and additional medical consultants. They all wanted to talk to the hero, but Olivia kept a low profile, visiting only during the quiet hours when the suits had gone home. She'd sit by his bed, sometimes studying her textbooks, sometimes just talking softly about her day. The nurses knew her now, slipping her extra blankets when she dozed off in the visitor's chair. They understood something she herself couldn't quite explain: why a struggling nursing student would spend her precious free hours watching over a billionaire who had some of the best medical care money could buy. On the 5th day, Victoria cornered her. "We want to thank you properly," she began, reaching for her checkbook, but Olivia stopped her. "Please don't," she said quietly. "I didn't do it for money. I did it because it's what I'm training to do. To help people who need help, regardless of who they are." Victoria studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "He's lucky it was you who found him. The doctors say your response time and accuracy with the EpiPen, it was textbook perfect. Where did you train?" "I'm still training," Olivia admitted. Third-year nursing student at Seattle Central. Though after missing that exam, she trailed off, trying not to think about how the missed test might affect her scholarship. Later that night, as she prepared to leave for her diner shift, Olivia made a decision. She pulled out a notepad from her bag and wrote a simple note. Mr. Thorne, I hope by the time you read this, you're feeling better. Please remember to carry an EpiPen. You can get them prescribed at any pharmacy. And maybe get that heart condition checked out. Take care of yourself, Olivia. She placed the note on his bedside table, beneath his phone. It was time to step back, to focus on salvaging what she could of her semester. She couldn't afford to spend any more nights in that hospital chair, no matter how much she wanted to make sure he was okay. As she walked out of room 742 for the last time, Olivia didn't notice Victoria watching her from the nurse's station, didn't see her pick up the note and read it, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. Didn't realize that her simple act of kindness had set in motion a chain of events that would soon turn her world upside down. The automatic doors of Seattle General hissed shut behind her as she stepped out into the cold evening air. Her diner shift started in 20 minutes, and after that, she had shelves to stock at the pharmacy. Life went on, even if her thoughts kept drifting back to room 742 and the man whose life she'd saved. What Olivia didn't know was that her next few weeks would make her question everything she thought she knew about fate, karma, and the true cost of being a good Samaritan. The first signs of trouble came in the form of a pink notice taped to Olivia's apartment door. The words, "Final Warning, Eviction Notice," glared at her in bold letters. Her hands shook as she read the document. She was 3 days late on rent, and her landlord, Mr. Brooks, had run out of patience. "Please, just give me until Friday," Olivia pleaded in Mr. Brooks's cramped office. The fluorescent light flickered above them, casting strange shadows on his impassive face. "You've said that before, Miss Bennett. 3 months of late payments. I run a business, not a charity." He shuffled some papers on his desk, avoiding her eyes. "You have 48 hours to vacate the premises." That night, Olivia sat cross-legged on her bare mattress, surrounded by the few possessions she owned. Her nursing textbooks were stacked neatly in a cardboard box, over $1,000 worth of knowledge that she might never use again. Her phone buzzed with a text from her boss at the pharmacy. Stock didn't arrive. "Don't come in tonight." That was the second job she'd lost this week. The pharmacy had been cutting her hours gradually, and now she pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting back tears. The diner was all she had left, and Joe had already warned her that business was slow. The next morning brought more devastating news. Her 2008 Toyota Corolla, the one she'd bought with 3 years of saved tips, made a horrible grinding noise and died in the middle of Aurora Avenue. The tow truck driver, a kind-faced man named Diego, gave her the verdict: transmission failure. Looking at about $2,800 for parts and labor, Diego said gently, seeing the color drain from her face. "Look, my cousin has a shop. Maybe he can." "I have $27.43 in my account," Olivia whispered. "The car's not even worth that much for parts." She stood on the sidewalk, watching as Diego towed away her car, her independence, her ability to get to work, her last remaining asset. The autumn rain mixed with her tears as she began the long walk to Seattle Central's administrative office. The dean's secretary, Mrs. Henderson, had known Olivia for 3 years. She'd watched the young woman juggle multiple jobs while maintaining a 3.8 GPA. Now, she watched with a heavy heart as Olivia signed the withdrawal papers. "Are you sure about this, dear?" Mrs. Henderson asked softly. "You're so close to finishing. Maybe we could look into emergency financial aid." Olivia's hand paused over the signature line. "I've already looked into everything. My scholarships required full-time enrollment, which I can't maintain anymore. Without a car, I can't get to my clinical rotations. Without my apartment," her voice cracked, "I have to be realistic." The weight of her decision hit her as she walked out of the administration building for the last time. 3 years of sacrifice, of falling asleep over textbooks, of memorizing medical terms during coffee breaks, all gone. The dream she'd held since she was 16, inspired by the nurses who'd cared for her mother during her final battle with cancer, was slipping away. That night, Olivia slept in her car. She'd managed to convince Diego to park it in his cousin's lot rather than the impound. The back seat was cramped, and the November air seeped through the windows, but it was better than the streets. She wrapped herself in her uniform from the diner, her last lifeline. Days blurred together. She used the diner's bathroom to wash up before shifts, kept her remaining clothes in a locker at work. Joe, the diner owner, pretended not to notice when she snuck extra food during her breaks or stayed late to clean up, just to remain in the warmth a little longer. "Order up." Joe's voice rang through the diner. "Table 7 needs their coffee refilled, Olivia." She grabbed the coffee pot, plastering on her best smile. Table 7 was occupied by a group of young tech workers, probably from one of the startups in the area. Their casual conversation about weekend plans and stock options felt like it was coming from another world, a world she'd been slowly falling away from. One of them was reading something on his tablet. Olivia caught a glimpse of the headline as she poured coffee. "Thorne Innovations CEO shows signs of recovery." There was a photo of Richard Thorne, looking healthy and robust, clearly from before his allergic reaction. She quickly looked away, pushing down the memory of that night. She couldn't afford to dwell on the past, not when her present was so precarious and her future so uncertain. Later that night, as she curled up in her broken-down car with only her nursing textbooks for a pillow, Olivia found herself wondering, had she made a mistake that night? Not in saving Richard's life. She'd never regret that, but in disappearing afterward? In refusing Victoria's offer of payment? Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Kindness should be its own reward, sweet girl." But as the cold seeped through her thin jacket and her stomach growled with hunger, Olivia couldn't help but wonder if sometimes kindness came at too high a price. What she didn't know was that across town, in the penthouse suite of Seattle's most exclusive hospital, Richard Thorne was finally opening his eyes. And his first words would set in motion a chain of events that would transform both their lives in ways neither could imagine. "Find her." Richard Thorne's first words after waking from his 2-week coma were barely a whisper, but they carried the weight of a command. "Find Olivia." Victoria Lane stood at his bedside, tablet in hand. "Sir, you need to rest." "The doctors." "The note," Richard interrupted, his voice stronger now. "Where's her note?" Victoria produced the simple handwritten message from her briefcase, watching as her boss read the words over and over. His fingers traced the signature, "Olivia," with an intensity she'd only seen him display during major business decisions. "She saved my life twice that night," he said, looking up at Victoria, "and then she disappeared, leaving nothing but this note and refusing any payment." Why? The next 48 hours saw the full power of Thorne Innovations mobilized in an unprecedented search. Security camera footage from the hospital was analyzed. Staff were interviewed. Richard remembered the diner uniform she'd been wearing that night, leading to a systematic search of every diner in Seattle. Meanwhile, Olivia was starting another exhausting shift at Joe's diner, unaware that her life was about to change. The breakfast rush was in full swing when she noticed an unusual number of suits entering the diner. Her heart nearly stopped when she recognized Victoria Lane among them. Before she could retreat to the kitchen, Victoria had spotted her. Their eyes met across the crowded diner, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then Victoria was speaking into her phone. "We found her." What happened next felt like a dream to Olivia. Joe appeared from the kitchen, telling her to take the rest of the day off. Victoria gently but firmly guided her to a waiting car, explaining that Richard Thorne wanted to thank her personally. "He's been searching for you," Victoria said as they drove through the city. "When we discovered you'd withdrawn from nursing school, lost your apartment, your car." She paused, studying Olivia's worn uniform and tired eyes. "Why didn't you come to us for help?" Olivia stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of her struggle fade behind them. "I didn't save him for a reward," she said softly. "It wasn't about money." The penthouse suite of Seattle Grace Hospital was a far cry from the emergency room where Olivia had last seen Richard. When she entered, he was sitting up in bed, looking considerably better than the last time she'd seen him. "Olivia Bennett," he said, his voice warm. "The guardian angel who carries emergency EpiPens and refuses rewards." What followed was a conversation that would change both their lives. Richard listened intently as Olivia reluctantly shared her story. The missed exam, the eviction, the car, the lost dream of becoming a nurse. With each detail, his expression grew more determined. "I've been thinking a lot during my recovery," he said finally. "About purpose, about karma, about the strange ways life works. Did you know I built Thorn Innovations from nothing? I was poor once too, working 3 jobs just like you. Someone gave me a chance. One person who believed in me. Now it's my turn to pay it forward." He reached for a folder on his bedside table. "I'm launching a new division at Thorn Innovations, TI Healthcare. We'll focus on making medical technology accessible to everyone, not just those who can afford it. And I want you to run it." Olivia's mouth fell open. "But I'm not even a qualified nurse yet. I dropped out." "You'll finish your degree. All expenses paid. In fact, if you want to go further, medical school, specialized training, whatever you dream of, it's yours. But more importantly, you have something that can't be taught: genuine compassion." That night, you didn't see a billionaire CEO. You saw someone who needed help. That's exactly the perspective this division needs. 3 months later, Olivia stood before a crowd at the opening of the first Thorn-Free clinic. Dressed in a simple but elegant suit, she spoke about accessibility to healthcare, about dignity, about second chances. Behind her, Richard beamed with pride. The clinic was the first of many. Under Olivia's leadership, TI Healthcare revolutionized community medical care. Her experience of struggling through nursing school while working multiple jobs informed every decision, every policy. No one would be turned away for lack of funds. Every clinic would stock emergency medications, including EpiPens, available to anyone who needed them. 1 year to the day after that fateful night, Olivia returned to the spot where she'd found Richard. The old apartment building was still there, still run down. But across the street stood a gleaming new medical clinic, its windows warm and welcoming. As she stood there, Richard joined her, both of them remembering that cold night that had changed everything. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "most people would have just called 911 and walked away, or asked for a reward afterward. But you stayed. You gave up your last EpiPen. You rode in that ambulance despite having an exam the next day. Why?" Olivia smiled, watching as a young mother led her child into the clinic. "Because everyone deserves help when they need it. Everyone deserves a chance." She turned to face him. "Just like you gave me." Above them, the Seattle sky cleared, and for a moment, the setting sun turned the clinic's windows to gold. Sometimes, karma works in mysterious ways, but it always comes full circle. And sometimes, the kindness you give to the world finds its way back to you, multiplied 1,000-fold.